Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we are hanging out with Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov. And he runs a great website called covertactionmagazine.com where we can learn everything we need to learn about the CIA and all of the covert action of the intelligence operations. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon, and we are with one of my absolute favorite guests, Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov, because we talk about all of the horrible dealings of intelligence, and he's got of the intelligence groups, organizations, criminal enterprises, and he's got a great article. Covertactionmagazine.com is the website to go to. All kinds of great stuff there. And here's what I like: as students go back to school, what pivotal acts of U.S. history, including the CIA history, will not be taught. So we're going to talk about some of the things in the CIA history, and let's start with the obvious: the JFK assassination. Following the release of a new batch of JFK assassination documents by the Trump administration, Professor Frederick Lovell was quoted in the New York Times stating his doubts that the new documents would overturn our understanding of what happened on that terrible day, where he believes Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone killed JFK. Really? So, of course, they've got a Harvard history professor. What a shock. That says, nah, Lee Harvey Oswald, he was just a lone gunman. There's bullets do all kinds of strange things. Forget all of the evidence of the CIA. Let's talk about some of the new things that have come out. And of course, students should be taught about what happened in our democracy. What do we know about the new stuff that's come out about the JFK assassination? And throw it in with some of the old stuff that makes it obvious that there was CIA spookery involved, Jeremy.
Sure. Well, we've had very recently members of the Secret Service who are still alive have come out. Abraham Bolden and a guy, I forget his name now, came out with a book very recently, saying there were extra bullets found and that this was covered up. So that's significant because that makes it impossible for Oswald to have been the lone assassin because there were more bullets than he fired. There were many bullets. I think there were, I think he fired 3 or 4 bullets, they allege, but yet there were 8 or 9 or 10 ultimately found on the scene, and there were some found in the limo that they covered up the number of bullets. So right there, it's an impossibility for him to have been the lone assassin. But what we know is that it's almost certain he was not the assassin at all, because 3 witnesses placed him in the lunchroom of the Texas School Book Depository on the 2nd floor 5 minutes before the shooting and less than 2 minutes after the shooting, calmly drinking a Coke, which would have been impossible for him to have run from the 6th floor to the complete other end of the building. And people who saw, and then he was somehow calm and had time to purchase a Coke and was calmly drinking it. And then there was a witness on the stairway, and they didn't see anybody run. They didn't see Oswald running down the stairway. So that evidence alone is very strong that Oswald was not the assassin. Beside the fact that it would have taken a super, most of the experts have found that Kennedy was shot firstly from the front. The shots came from the grassy knoll. It was impossible. If you go to the museum today, you see how far it is from where the motorcade was passing through, and it would have taken like the world's best sniper, which Oswald was not. He had very poor marks when he was in the military. And then there's the Warren Commission. This official story that they're still teaching students at Harvard, if they address this topic at all. assumes the magic bullet theory that the Warren Commission advanced, which was defied the laws of physics, that the bullet somehow went on a downward trajectory into Kennedy and then came upward after leaving his body and hit John Connolly, and that defies the laws of physics. So, you know, it's just, and then there's so much information that has come out regarding Oswald and how he was an intelligence agent, and he was set up as a patsy, and he was even calling, from the Texas theater, he was calling this intelligence center because he was asking them what to do. But they had set him up, and sign of intelligence operation is that there were Oswald doubles seen. There were 2 or 3 Oswalds, and then also they crafted this elaborate story about him. There were Oswald doubles seen in Mexico, because the official story had him, that he was this pro-communist, and so they set him up in the Fair Play for Cuba committee. They set him up to be arrested, so he'd get a name in the papers to be associated with the Fair Play for Cuba committee, which was against U.S. foreign intervention in Cuba, against the Cuban Revolution. But really, he was an infiltrator. In fact, that organization didn't exist. New Orleans is a very right-wing city. There aren't many, even today, left-wing groups. And that group didn't exist. Oswald created it. He was one of, I think, 2 members who were both intelligence agents. And he was working with Guy Bannister, who was an FBI, CIA operative who had offices in New Orleans when he was there before he went to work for the Texas School Book Depository. And that building was owned by D.H. Byrd, who had strong connection to the CIA and was a profiteer, made a lot of money off the Vietnam War. And after the assassination, and he kept a replica of the sniper's nest because he was proud. But I mean, there's so much evidence that the basic evidence would indicate Oswald could not have been the shooter, just based on the eyewitness testimony. But Lauderdale just ignores all the evidence, as do his colleagues, and they continue to promote the lone gun narrative, lone myth assassin, and they smear anybody as conspiracy theorists who actually does any research on this topic. And there are a ton of books and a lot that have come out by good researchers who've done a lot of the work. I mean, it's an insult to them. They put in hours and hours of work to try and uncover the truth about this case. And there are different theories, but a lot of the new scholarship is pointing to a key role played by Lyndon Johnson, that the Kennedys were going to drop. John Kennedy was dropping Johnson from the 64 ticket, that Robert Kennedy was leaking information to Life magazine about corruption Johnson was involved with a Texas swindler, Billy Sol Estes, who was Johnson's top political donor and kind of sugar daddy, and that Johnson had been involved in political murders in Texas after he carried out fraud in the 48 election for U.S. Senate. Kennedy was the attorney general, had a thick file on Johnson and his misdeeds, and he was leaking it to the media because they were intent on dropping him and selecting somebody else to run with John F. Kennedy in the 64 race. And Johnson was desperate, and so he and his CIA buddies, because Johnson was the CIA's man in the Senate for years, and his Texas cronies, the Texas oil people hated Kennedy because he was ending the oil depletion allowance, and Johnson had been their cash cow for years because he gave them government contracts. So they were riding with LBJ all the way, and they wanted Kennedy out. And a lot were tied. Like D.H. Byrd is a liaison with the CIA because he owned companies that were CIA companies, like in data mining and electronics. And he also owned the Texas School Book Depository. He made a fortune in oil, and he was one of Johnson's cronies. And some of the Texas CIA operatives played a key role, like David Atlee Phillips, as well as figures like E. Howard Hunt. And there's a photograph that was at least three people identified the CIA operative Edward Lansdale at the scene of the assassination a short while after Kennedy was killed in a famous photo. And Lansdale's own wife identified him, as well as top people in the military who had worked with him, including L. Fletcher Prouty. And Lansdale, 11 days, I think, after Johnson became president, Lansdale got a top position to run the counterinsurgency operation in Vietnam. He had been let go. He had been close with the Kennedys, and he had been kind of their counterinsurgency guru, but he had a falling out with them, and he was fired before the assassination. And then 11 days later, he's back in the top counterinsurgency job in Vietnam. So he had in part a personal incentive, but he was clearly one of the strong indication. He was one of the people on the ground managing this, and this was a very sophisticated criminal operation. You can't have just one guy with a goes up on and starts shooting at the president. It just doesn't work that way. It takes huge financing, huge planning by professional assassins, and that's the CIA worked with the mafia and is, as we've discussed, an organized crime agency that employs assassins. They killed people all around the world. They're pretty open about that. They had an assassination manual. So it takes professionals to carry out something like this. And throughout history, it's American exceptionalism to think that American history is different from other nations, where you have constant conspiracies and political assassinations, and it's never a lone nut guy. You can't do it. It requires a lot of elaborate planning and financing in other countries, just like here, and there's underlying, political agendas. I mean, you had the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand. These events are often key events in history, and usually changing things much for the worse, or causing wars. And that was the situation with the Kennedy assassination. Although I don't think Kennedy was a saint in any way. I mean, I think his presidency was very troubled and pro-imperialistic, but these even more hawkish elements took over after him and ramped things up to the next level in Vietnam and elsewhere, and crushed our democracy further here at home.
In fact, if I'm not mistaken, didn't the CIA, weren't they involved in a car bombing over on Independence Avenue in Washington, D.C.? I think it was a guy from South America or something. You remember
Yes,
that?
Orlando Letelier. This was after the fascist coup in Chile that the CIA supported, and then Orlando Letelier was a economic advisor to Salvador Allende, and he had very progressive economic program, and he had a good stature. He wrote articles, and he gave speeches, and people really respected his ideas. And he was more social democrat, countering the neoliberal economics. So they saw him as a threat. And yeah, that was linked to the Chilean intelligence service and a guy named Michael Townley, who was an American. Well, they always claim he's ex-CIA, but once you're in the CIA, always in the CIA. And they kind of because he was ultimately implicated in the bombing. This guy Townley, who was an American right-winger CIA living in Chile, and then they kind of said, oh, he left the agency, but you know,
Yeah, and
so
then he went on he became he left the agency and just decided to do car bombs as a hobby, I guess. Maybe is it something to do on the weekends?
yeah. So I mean, yeah, they're expert, and they brazenly took these acts here into the United States, and that's always what the Anti-Imperialist League, going back to the early 20th century, had said: you can't have an empire and a democracy; it's going to destroy our democracy. And that's exactly what happened. They developed, assassination, coup. They were involved in these kind of undemocratic criminal activity abroad, coups, assassinations. They cultivated specialists in assassination, and then is it any surprise that these guys would apply their skills domestically when there was a leader they saw as too liberal or they didn't like in different ways?
Another one that's interesting, and what's sad for me is I met the guy some years ago and had an opportunity and didn't actually investigate him. Right, Martin Luther King assassination. The guy that looked into its name was William F. Pepper. And I'm pretty sure I met him 10 or 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. I met him in Washington, D.C., and he told me that he was the king's lawyer, the lawyer for that event. And I'm like, oh crap, I met that guy. Did an in-depth discussion with him. But again, something else that they're not going to, well, here's what we're taught. Martin Luther King was a saint, and he was kind of like Moses, let my people go. And, he was just he wanted to make the world a better place and blah, blah, blah. And, I had a dream, he tells us, but they don't tell us all the stuff he said about the war machine. That he was basically opposed to the war, that he gave speeches against the Vietnam War. And I mean, said all of these things that the machine, and ultimately, it appears to me there's a significant amount of evidence that shows in our history that particularly the FBI, but what you have is this. Similar to the JFK assassination is the historical profession's cover-up of the FBI's role in the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. The FBI's coordination of King's murder was exposed in a trilogy of books written by William F. Pepper, the King family lawyer. What do we need to know about the government's role in the King assassination?
Well, yeah, Pepper was a remarkable man, and there's a new documentary that was made by John Barber that I saw screening I was at a whistleblower conference, and the Barber was there and screened. He's a Canadian actor, and he made this kind of tribute to William Pepper, which is a great film. And yeah, Pepper wrote 3 books, and he did remarkable research. And he made major breakthroughs in the case. He was able to interview and gain an admission from a guy named Lloyd Jowers, who owned Jim's Grill behind where the Lorraine Motel where King was shot. And Jowers admitted, because people saw him go out into the bush and then come back and disassemble a gun and hide it in his restaurant. And first, I think Pepper got to a waitress who had an affair. It was, I guess, a mistress of Jowers. And then Jowers, toward the end of his life, came clean about his role. And Pepper staged a trial that was not covered in the media, but the jury found them guilty. Jowers and the FBI was implicated. The other person he tracked down was a guy named Russell Atkins, whose father had been in the so-called Dixie Mafia and was a city government official. And Atkins said that Clyde Tolson, he was so close that he called him Uncle Clyde. That was J. Edgar Hoover's right-hand man and gay lover, Clyde Tolson. And he came all the time, and they had these planning meetings, and he was a teenager, and they planned it all out in elaborate detail, and there was a lot of money exchanged. And it was an elaborate plan that included paying off the warden. And Pepper found that the warden at the Missouri jail, because James Earl Ray, the patsy like Oswald, he was like a petty criminal. Now that they made up like he was a racist, there's actually no evidence that he was a racist. And he had been in the military, and his family said he changed after he was in the military, and that he was subjected to some kind of MK Ultra mind control thing. And he was connected to the military, and then he was involved in just petty crime, non-violent, and he'd get like short jail sentences. And so he was in the Missouri penitentiary, and the warden was connected with the U.S. intelligence apparatus. And Atkins said he was paid off to facilitate Ray's escape, and that's how they can control him. An escaped inmate is totally dependent on the people who help him escape, to get new identity, to get money, etc. And they told him exactly where to go. And they say, oh, meet this guy Raul in Montreal. He went up to Montreal, and then Raul had, you're going to, do this job for me. And he thought he was, it was kind of another petty crime, like delivering some weapons or some money to somebody. And he was told where to go. And, he was put up in this rooming house. But then again, the friend and he was set up, and it's also impossible for him to have been the. It's similar to the JFK. If you look into it, the shooter came from the version of the grassy knoll. It was a grassy area behind Jim's Grill that was a lot closer because they said Ray shot King from the boarding house, but that's actually far from the hotel where King was, Lorraine Motel. And there was actually foliage. You know what they did? The morning after, they cut all this foliage because it would have blocked the shot. It would have been impossible. So they cleared like 6 in the morning. A crew was out there clearing some foliage to make it more plausible that shots came from the boarding house. But Pepper and others who recreated the shooting said for the shots to have even looking at the angle, Ray would have had to have been hanging out of the a bathroom window with like one leg hanging out, somehow shooting sidearm, and again, like the most incredible shot in the world. That only like maybe the world best assassin could do that. Could actually hit its target from that distance. And then if you add to the equation hanging out of a window sideways, nope, even the best assassin couldn't do it. And again, Ray had very bad records back in military career. They reviewed his records, and he was a poor shot, and he never did well. So it just, Pepper's research was incredible. I mean, for those of us like you, Garland, you're a police investigator and have a background. We tip our hat to him. I mean, what he achieved, tracking down these witnesses, getting and he also tracked down the nurses at the hospital, and a son of a nurse who said his mother said that King was still alive when he came into the hospital, and the doctor, Breen Bland, had the nurses go out of the room, but she saw as she left the room that he made sure he died. He smothered him to death instead of trying to save him. So
You
all
know what?
that.
Well, let me add this. Here's what's interesting. What's interesting is nobody's ever told, nobody ever knows that King didn't die on the scene. Everybody thinks that he died on the scene. And the mainstream, everything is he was shot and he died on the scene. Nobody knows that he actually died in the hospital.
Correct, yeah. And nobody knows that he was lured to Memphis because Memphis was a very favorable environment, because the city police chief had been a top FBI person, and I think had been Hoover's like personal secretary at one point. It was very close to J. Edgar Hoover, Holloman. And and the mayor was really anti-King, so they had a very favorable terrain in Memphis. So they lured him there, and according to Pepper, the famous garbage worker strike, well, it started when two garbage workers were mangled in a garbage truck. Pepper found evidence that some mafia elements threw these poor guys in the truck so they'd be killed, and it would spark a strike. Uh, yeah, I mean, Pepper really uncovered so much, but this is not being taught to students. This woman at Yale University, who is a very bright woman, and she's written some good books before. I assigned one of her books that dealt with the Wall Street bombing after World War One, where anarchists bombed J.P. Morgan's offices because they blamed him for getting the U.S. into World War One. It was a very good book. So, I mean, this is not a dumb person. This is a good historian. So why she wrote a Pulitzer Prize winning biography of J. Edgar Hoover, won the Pulitzer Prize a couple years ago, and it is a good book, and it's critical of Hoover. It's well written, very deeply researched, but when it gets to the King assassination, I was disgusted because none of what we were just discussing is in the book, and she cites Pepper. She does cite his book, but says none of the information that the key information or any of the information from his investigation is presented in the book, which implicates J. Edgar Hoover through Clyde Tolson was the key guy doing the legwork. So it's and this is Yale, and this is supposedly the best and the brightest, and it is a bright woman who has talent as a historian. So, and then also it covers up the new evidence, show that the FBI helped cover up the RFK assassination, and that's not to be found in that book either. So I think it's a major failing of historians. I mean, a lot of the public is skeptical. Students, want to learn the truth, and they also want to, part of the job of professors is to develop good research methodologies among students, get them to really assess the evidence, objectively, and dig into it. And a Pepper is a model researcher. So they're just kind of ridiculing or leaving, as conspiracy theorists, or leaving it out. And they're distorting American history, because we have a right to know that it was the American government that murdered King. I mean, they might celebrate him today, but it shouldn't be forgotten that in his lifetime he was attacked. I mean, he was attacked in the media, ridiculed, attacked as a communist, and ultimately, the FBI. The evidence indicate that the FBI was behind his assassination, and that should breed skepticism about the FBI as an agency. So it's an
Well,
important history. Yeah.
even when we're talking about the history that kids didn't learn, I always thought, okay, some guy hated Abraham Lincoln and he was in Ford's Theater and he climbed down and he shot him and that was it. That's all I was taught in school. So at some point, I was very interested in Lincoln as a interesting guy. I read some of his stuff. I realized, man, that guy was brilliant. Lincoln was a brilliant man, a brilliant writer, an absolutely brilliant man. And I started reading about him and reading his stuff, and I found out, wait a minute, that was not a lone gunman trying to kill him. On that night, it was a decapitation strike. They attacked his entire cabinet. Seward, all of them. I think Seward, one of them, was in bed recovering from some kind of injury or something, and a guy attacked him with a knife to kill him. And he got out of bed, it was recovered from his injuries, and fought the guy off and survived. There was it was a not only was it multiple attackers trying to decapitate his entire cabinet, but then the what's his name, the guy that Booth was headed to Toronto apparently. And he had a doctor, Dr. Mudd, and he went, and all of these things happened to clearly show. I also then found out at that time, and it's what, for some reason, it's always in Canada, it's always Montreal, it's always Toronto, which shows me that there is a French and or British connection. You know what I mean? That there's some of these other imperial colonial powers are always involved in this kind of stuff. They're always heading to Toronto or something's plotted in Montreal. But then I found out that like during the entire war, that both the South and the North had emissaries in Toronto who were negotiating, and that this thing was cooked up or something apparently in Toronto. And there was this connection. And when you read all of that, it's like, well, wait a minute. What's suspicious is that we're taught that John Wilkes Booth was a lone gunman, when in fact, you don't have to dig far to find out that it was an attempt to take out, that this was a very, very, first of all, if there were 4 or 5 people trying to kill the entire cabinet of the Lincoln administration, this wasn't 1 or 2 guys. This was a very significant, deep, powerful, well-financed plot against Lincoln.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm planning a book on political assassinations that looks and starts with the Lincoln assassination. So I've been doing a lot of research on these different assassinations over the last 3 or 4 years. And yeah, there are some new books on the Lincoln assassination that are very good in showing what you're discussing, that this was an elaborate, lavishly financed conspiracy involving some very powerful people, including top cabinet level officials, such as Edwin Stanton, who some of it was just a power play. They wanted power for themselves. Some of it was hatred of Lincoln, who was viewed, as much as he's revered today, he was viewed as a tyrant, and certainly in the South, but even people in the North, because he had forced conscription, and there were aspects of the Civil War they didn't like. And also the banking. He was also, though, challenging. He was trying to fund the Civil War through Congress, and assert more public control over the U.S. money supply. So the banking elements hated Lincoln, who was actually, a good leader in that respect. And yeah, Booth was it was an elaborately financed plot. And then there's a lot of evidence that Booth got away in the end. They made like he was killed in this farmhouse in Maryland. I mean, firstly, we know it's a plot because how did he get out of the city? Their police paid to let him through, and there was a code word he gave that he was able to get out of the city after shooting Lincoln, and then people were protecting him in his escape. And then there was the story that he was shot in this farmhouse. But historian and Unsolved Mysteries did a good program about this some years ago, and that's a great show. They took it off the air, but that was one of the few programs the mainstream media, and they had a great host. That was my favorite show as a kid with Robert Stack. He was really kind of eerie, but he was a terrific host. And they would cover this stuff, like do good investigations into the King, the Kennedy, and they did a show on Vince Foster and all this stuff, and they had one on the Lincoln and Booth, and they had historians who said that it was not Booth. That there's strong evidence that the person killed did not resemble Booth at all. And then actually Booth's lawyer, a guy wrote a book in the early 1900s saying that he was Booth's lawyer, that Booth had escaped and lived in Texas and Oklahoma and had people supporting him, and that he was his lawyer, and that he died in Enid, Oklahoma around the turn of the 20th century. And there's pretty strong evidence that story is true. So, and to me, it gets at the point of American exceptionalism, that they're distorting the history for young people to make like American history is different from other countries. And that we have this pure democracy where there were a few lone gunmen, but the authorities got them, and the justice was restored, and there weren't these what these are really are coups d'état, and we're not supposed to have coups d'état. We're supposed to have this pure democracy, and these are elite coups d'états. And Lincoln was replaced with Andrew Johnson, who was hostile toward was supported basically the Confederacy and effort to attack the black population in the South. And then again, Johnson ramped up the Vietnam War and was more hawkish than Kennedy, more favorable to the oil interests. Even if Kennedy was not exactly a saint either, but.
And here's the interesting thing: that there was a woman hung, Mary Surratt was her name, right? And they said she was a widow with connections in Southern Maryland countryside. Here's the interesting thing: she come from a very wealthy family. When I was in a car accident, I went to a hospital just outside of DC on Surratt's Road, named after her family. So you look at these people. Booth was from a famous acting family. You look at the people that were involved, and you're like, isn't that interesting? You can look at the people that are involved and connect them to like very, very powerful figures and powerful family. You know what I mean? And you can see that it was almost like actually they planned on doing the same thing to FDR, except what's his name ratted him out. So you look at
Smedley
this.
Butler, there was a coup. The Liberty League was set up. They spread all kinds of propaganda against Roosevelt that he was a socialist, and it was funded by the usual suspects, J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, I think, and those kind of billionaire class. And they enlisted Smedley Butler to carry out the coup, but Butler ratted them out to Congress. So we've had repeated coup attempts in our history, and actual coup assassinations / coups.
I was told that the Russians were convinced that FDR was poisoned, although he had a lot of health problems and what have you. But I was told that they were convinced that he was poisoned. And you also talk about something interesting, and that was Henry Wallace, who was Roosevelt's vice president, who had he become president, we wouldn't have the Cold War. A lot of things wouldn't have happened that if Henry Wallace had been president. Talk about the history involving him.
Yeah, Henry Wallace was a remarkable figure, and I think he could be a model. Most people are cynical about almost all politicians, but there have been a few good guys, I think, throughout history who set a good model that hopefully we could replicate again. Wallace was he was the agricultural secretary in the Great Depression. He came from Iowa. He was came from a farming family and ran a farming newsletter. The agricultural building is named after him today. He was very successful head of that department in the Depression. And he was a very worldly guy who traveled to a lot of different countries. He wrote books about Russia, China, and he was a peace-oriented guy. He wanted to understand the politics and history of other countries so the U.S. could forge better and good diplomatic relation with those countries. And sometimes he would anger the diplomats. Like he would go to a country in South America and he would skip a diplomatic function to actually just go talk to people and see what was going on and see how the U.S. could develop a good policy toward that country and maybe address some of the problems in the country. So he was a really good guy, and he was pushing. The Roosevelt administration had adopted, a good diplomatic relations with the Russian during World War II. And he wanted to continue that. He had traveled to the Soviet Union. He saw that the Russian people, after the terrible devastation of World War II and what they had suffered at the hands of the Nazis, that they did not want another war, no way. And that at that time, they had very high feeling for American because of the Lend-Lease aid that the United States had provided to the Soviet Union to help in the defeat of the Nazis. So there was a lot of goodwill. And there was no desire for any kind of conflict whatsoever, that they wanted to rebuild their country. And he wrote a book about that. And I think the book was called like Peace with Moscow or something like that. And he wrote several books. And yeah, he had a vision of continuing Roosevelt's peaceful approach toward the Russians that would have averted the Cold War, that would have maintained good diplomatic relations. And he wanted to close down American air bases. He said, we're going to have it's going to be a new century of the people, and there's going to be no more colonialism. The British Empire is dying. But, you had Henry Luce who was saying we need a new American century. We need to be the dominant country. But Wallace said, no, there's no more empires. This is the people's century. We can use our resources to help developing countries industrialize, but we're not going to exploit their.
Uh-oh, Jeremy's freezing up a little bit. We may be losing Jeremy. Hope he comes back. If you can hear me, Jeremy, just sign out and re-sign back in.
Oh, is it good?
Oh, there you go. You're back. Okay, you were froze for a few minutes.
Yeah, so I don't know if you caught what I said, but he said that they didn't want to colonize the globe with military bases. They didn't want to exploit other nations economically, sustain peaceful relations with the Russians. And that brought up some red flags among the business elite, especially coming out of World War II, where the U.S. economy had emerged out of World War II very strong because the war put people back to work, and the war industry, earned a lot of profits for a lot of people, and they were worried that if the military budget was cut, if a peaceful world order was a threat to big business. So at there was a coup at the 1944 Democratic Party convention because Wallace, Roosevelt was still alive. And he was, renominated the president, but it was known he probably wouldn't live out his term because, as he said, he was ill. So the vice presidential position was very crucial. And Wallace had the large support. He had, I think, 65 to 70% support among the delegates. But there was a mysterious blackout, and he was about to be renominated, and suddenly the lights went out. And according to various accounts, there was a horse trading that went on in the back rooms, and they, replaced Wallace overnight with Harry Truman. And Truman was a simpleton from Missouri, whereas Wallace was a worldly intellectual. Truman was the last president who didn't even have a college degree, had never been outside the United States except for service in World War I, and was tied with the mafia Pendergast machine in Missouri that had put him in power. And they knew they could manipulate Truman to do what they wanted, the big business power elite. So it was a coup. Wallace lost, and then he was fired as Commerce Secretary. He started giving speeches, and he would pack Madison Square Garden, advancing his vision of a cooperative world order, speaking out against the Russophobic rhetoric. And he said something like, if the Russians will invade us, they're going to walk. I mean, they're not, there's no military threat from Russia. And then they started red baiting him. He was fired as Commerce Secretary, and then he tried to run as an independent in 1948. And it was a strategy that the Democrats were worried he would. I don't think they thought he would win the election, but they're worried he's going to take some votes away from them, and that will give the election to Thomas Dewey, the Republican candidate. So they started red baiting him, and there's memos that have been declassified where Clark Clifford is like the power broker, lawyer in the Democratic Party, said, "Oh, we have to smear him as a communist, make the public think he's a communist, play that up," and that was the beginning of McCarthyism. And it really started with the Democratic Party, the prelude to today's Russiagate. But in that article, I say, well, historian, instead of celebrating Wallace, and there are some good books written about him that are favorable, they could assign those to students. But there are new books that have come out attacking Wallace, basically repeating the smears of the 40s Democratic Party. Oh, that he was a communist dupe. He was naive about the Soviet Union. He was a tool of the communists, because his view was, well, and Wallace was never a communist. He was more like progressive New Dealer. But he's like, well, they're just another political party. We can deal with them. We can deal with the Soviets. I mean, we don't have the exact same worldview, but it's just another country we can deal with, and we can deal with communists domestically. I mean, at that time there was a legal communist party that had some influence, and some were supporting him because a lot of his platform aligned with theirs, except for a few issues like he wasn't for nationalized industry, but a lot of other things they were on the same page. So you had some communists supporting him. So they used that and say, oh, his campaign was infiltrated by communists, and he was just a tool of the communists, and it would lead to communist takeover of the United States. And they're publishing books like that, and that they're the professors, that's what they're telling students. And Oliver Stone and Peter Kuznick, in their Untold History of the United States, they did present Wallace very favorably, and they were attacked. Like this Princeton historian attacked them in the New York Review of Books, and went on the offensive against them. I think the anti-Wallace narrative is what often gets taught to students, and that's what I experienced. And I even got hostility to the school I was teaching when I did a favorable review of the Stone Kuznick book. I had a Russian guy from Harvard, a Russian specialist, attacking me. He even wrote these angry notes. Oh, Wallace was a communist, and how dare you?
What's also interesting is this: that at the time they were going after him at the end of the World War II, when they were making sure that anyone who had propensity towards a peaceful, completely a peaceful relationship and a non-threatening Cold War style relationship with Russia, at the time they were doing that, Operation Paperclip was going on. So at the time they were doing that, they were literally shipping Nazis in from Germany. They were shipping Nazis, making sure that they got out of Germany, getting them into Canada, getting into different places. So while the people in power were going after people, calling them communists and things like that, the OSS or CIA or whatever it is was busy shipping Nazis in everywhere.
Yeah, and that's one reason I think they wanted to deflect attention away. The Dulles brothers and the Prescott Bush had been complicit in the rise of Nazism, and had worked with a lot of Nazi financiers, and had committed treason. I think they, the banks that they worked for and Wall Street firms had continued business relations with some of these Nazis in violation of the Trading with the Enemy Act, even after the United States went to war with Nazi Germany. So they were actual traitors of the United States, and they were being investigated. There were a Department of Justice investigations being opened up. There were some senators, like congressmen like Jerry Voorhees, who were initiating investigations. And that's when they brought in Nixon. They funded and supported Nixon, in Congress to attack Jerry Voorhees as a communist. And that's how Nixon got into office, and then became a powerful figure because he had these top people supporting him and supporting those kind of politicians who would play the McCarthy card, because it turned attention away from their treason to the alleged treason of people in the Roosevelt and Wallace administration, who were like Alger Hiss, who were accused of being communist spies. And then the history, is distorted today. Like that's what I was saying in the article, because like even Alger Hiss, he's presented as a communist agent in a lot of American history courses that cover that period, and they invoke these documents that supposedly that came out, after the Soviet Union collapse. Some new documents were released from the Soviet archive, but actually the documents don't prove anything. There's a reference to a guy, a code name Alice, ALES, and they say, oh, that is similar to Alger, it has to be him. But another historian looked into it and found that Alice was in a certain place and Alger was somewhere else, and it couldn't have been him. So that there's no actual evidence, and no evidence has ever emerged that Hiss gave anything to the Soviets. And in fact, the story of Whittaker Chambers, who was the key witness in that trial against him, was full of holes. And then these documents that supposedly Hiss had given him, that he hid in his farm, proved to be mundane documents, State Department documents. It couldn't have, if by chance he gave them to the Soviets, which there's no evidence he did, they wouldn't compromise national security, because it was like a report on Brazil's economy or something. So there's no evidence, but they make it's like this elaborate Russian spy plot to subvert America and Alger Hiss. And it plays into this Russophobia that we see today, so that they're continuously distorting the history of the Cold War to make it seem like there was a very real Russian plot to subvert the American government then, as there is now with the 2016 election. So it's just benefiting the narrative of U.S. intelligence agencies and State Department. And historians should provoke critical thinking and be true to the facts, but they're often not. And young people aren't learning the true story unless they go off on their own, and do a lot of reading on their own, which unfortunately a lot don't. I mean, they're busy with other things. One thing I found disgusting in my research was how a group of historians are totally distorting the Vietnam War and the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, and how they're presenting America's South Vietnamese allies as honorable. And they use it's like this kind of phony progressive rhetoric, like a decolonization, to say, like they frame it in a way that makes it seem very progressive and sophisticated, but really they're revitalizing old CIA arguments from the 50s. That because the CIA had claimed, the U.S. had to save South Vietnam from North Vietnamese aggression, and they're basically repeating that. And they're saying, South Vietnam was a viable independent nation. But meanwhile, most Vietnamese saw their nation as one nation, not two. It was an artificial division, and there were supposed to be elections in the South, and the U.S. never allowed those elections, because Eisenhower had said that Ho Chi Minh, communist, would win the election with 80% of the vote, so they never allowed it. And they put in this guy and goes in Diem, and even these books, because I read several books by these so-called revisionist historians who are trying to rehabilitate the South Vietnamese and say America wasn't so influential. It was a Vietnamese affair, and Americans were kind of secondary. And some go so far as say American troops behave well. They started attacking. One book by a guy at the University of San Diego was attacking the Bertrand Russell Tribunal and said, "Oh, the war crimes of America weren't systematic, and American troops behave well." And meanwhile, new books have come out by Nick Turse, did a year's investigation in American archives, and then he went to Vietnam, trekked in remote areas, interviewed people who had experienced terrible atrocities by U.S. troops, and just added to our knowledge of what we already knew. I mean, this was a war where American soldiers came back and held hearings like the Winter Soldier hearing, where they testified that they had committed terrible crimes against the Vietnamese people, and they were ashamed of what they did, and they wanted to alert the American public. And they discussed how they had been brainwashed in their military training to hate the Vietnamese, and they had the rabbit trick where they were dehumanized in their military training. They were given a rabbit to care for, and then the lieutenant would snap the neck the day before they went to Vietnam. So they're hardened for war, to kill. And they said that's not right. And these historians are just ignoring all that. That's what disturbs me. They're teaching a false history, and it's just whitewashing the record of the American empire and the horrific crimes that committed in the Vietnam War. That could be a cautionary tale for a younger generation that we should never support that kind of war again. That the military training has to be changed. But unfortunately, we've seen war after war after war. So, I mean, they're playing a societal function by erasing the past so we can continue to wage these bankrupt wars. So it's really very pernicious what they're doing, and they masquerade in this kind of progressive rhetoric. So hopefully more people be alert to this. I think education is crucial, that young people learn the real history, and then we can move forward and build a better society. But if they're not learning the right history, they're kind of lost. And that's by design, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, let me see if I can. There we go. Well, thank you very much. Certainly appreciate that. As always, we learn a lot talking to Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov. Before we go, tell everybody about your site, covertactionmagazine.com, a little bit of history and what they need to know about it.
Yes, covert action, and that's another thing I go into the article, that they're not teaching the history of the CIA, which is able to continue to run roughshod over the world and over our democracy. And there was a recent book by Hugh Wilford that came out, The CIA and Imperial History, and he did say that at the beginning, that this is one of the first books that actually tell the history, by I guess an academic publisher, that tell the history of the CIA, and it's a complete omission. All these textbooks on American foreign policy totally omit the CIA, and then some portray it favorably. And there was an article in the Society of Diplomatic Historian Journal, "The CIA: A Force for Peace."
Oh my
So
God.
anyway, that's why we have this website, to educate people about the true nature of the CIA and how it's warped democracy in the United States and caused a lot of atrocities around the world that are not in the interest, I don't think, of Americans. It blackens our reputation and name, and it just causes injustices that shouldn't be continuously repeated. So we have a lot of historical articles on the website, as well as covering contemporary affairs. Of course, it's hard to cover the CIA because they're secretive agency. They're not out in the open what they're doing, and unless you have a whistleblower, and they don't disclose their documents. They hide the documents, but a lot has come out over the years, and a lot of the history can be traced out. And even the present, like I monitor the National Endowment for Democracy because that's a CIA offshoot that's involved with political propaganda. So that's one thing you can, and they're involved in color revolutions in different countries. So that's one thing you can track pretty easily. And we just cover U.S. foreign policy from a more critical view from the mainstream, and look at the political economy of U.S. empire that drives a lot of these injustices, and try and recreate the history and help educate people about the history of the CIA and some of the atrocious things they've done and have never been held accountable for.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I was just showing people there's a lot of good stuff. One thing I found is, as Chris Hedges said, whenever the mainstream media opens the, has a headline of a particular article and there's a question, the answer is no. And whenever alternative media does, the answer is yes.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
added the second part. But thank you very much, everybody. So make sure you go to covertactionmagazine.com, and there's a lot you'll learn. One of my favorite websites. So you can stay there for hours. You can download stuff off there. It's great. Make sure you become a member. Thank you very much, Jeremy, and look forward to talking to you again soon. Everybody, follow me on Rockfin and Rumble and all that kind of stuff. If you can afford it, Patreon or buy me a coffee or whatever the case is, highly appreciated. And of course, I got my P.O. Box number for snail mail. We're out.